G'day all, it's just Ben here, just going to talk to you guys briefly about seafood processing and the safety components related to it. So within this presentation we're going to talk about the associated topics of obviously the importance of food safety in aquaculture and any other seafood processing businesses related to fisheries management, so on and so forth. We're going to talk about how the damage to the product and other contaminants may enter into our processing systems, and I think some of you may already have some preconceived ideas about how we can damage the product and obviously potential contaminants that may venture into our systems. Right, and what we've got down here is obviously something for an old program, but what do we need to do next week when we're fishing? And for you guys it might be what do we need to do in relation to our seafood processing for your practical that is going to come up online at the end of your assessment process, where we need you to perform some simple food processing at home or in the workplace if you've got access to a workplace. So what is the importance of food safety? I mean, look at the old dude down in the corner, and you look at his pizza box and you look at his dirty cup and his clothing. His missus is quite clean, and he's basically saying he's just finished his food safety course online. It's pretty easy to get certificates these days, but isn't a valuable source without actually understanding what's going on in the background. So have you ever eaten something and found broken glass in it? Ever eaten a meal at a restaurant and found a hair in it? Have you ever been to someone's house for dinner and watched them drop the food on the floor and still serve it up to you? I know that if I do that, the food goes on my plate, no one else's. So, they're obviously sources of contamination and possibly even bacterial sources within inside those foods if they end up on somebody else's plate. Alright, so where can we apply food safety? We're using this one in an aquaculture context, but where can we use it in the seafood industry is probably the perfect way to go. And a couple of simple points. The first one is obviously processing the product for market. Now, there's heaps of different processing or ways we go about processing product, and I think we've illustrated that in some of the information on Blackboard, so I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. Obviously preparing the food for the animals, so in an aquaculture context, if we're feeding our fish or our crustaceans or whatever it might be, we want to make sure that we're not passing bacteria to them that may end up being passed on to the consumer at the other end. Right, so why is it all important? You've probably got a bit of an idea rattling around in the back of your head. Ultimately, it's to protect the consumer from things like getting food poisoning. Alright, so food poisoning is probably the most common thing we think about when we think about food safety, but there are other components that are related to it. And some of those components relate to how the product can be damaged. Alright, and that picture there says, wait, I've got a hair in my salad, and it's actually a rabbit digging into his salad. Alright, so we've got heaps of different forms of what we would term the very first classification that we think about over here. Whoops-a-daisies, probably went a little bit too far there. Go backwards. In terms of physical damage, so physical damage relates to, you know, the impact on a product from dropping, bruising, rough handling. Temperature may denature proteins, may make the flesh soggy, may make it dry, so on and so forth. Physical contaminants of the product could also include bones, metal, fiberglass, fingernails, band-aids, you name it. Sewage and soil. So these are all the things we sort of need to manage through based on the physical components that may enter into our food. How else can our product be damaged? Quite honestly, we never really think about chemical contamination, but the overuse of chemicals to treat our products, and generally speaking, prawns are probably the easiest one to understand. And this product known as metabisulfite is actually a like an antioxidant. It actually extends the life of the prawns on the shelf at the other end. the underuse of chemicals leading to protein breakdown, accidental use of chemicals, e.g. over-sterilising, disinfecting or not neutralising chemicals, and something very simple there might be the use of detergents or chlorine on our processing surfaces and not adequately removing those afterwards or allowing the surfaces to dry out before we process on them. Spilling the gut contents of the product onto the flesh, even storing our fish the wrong way up in a processing environment, so i.e. upside down, can lead to the leaking of gut contents into the flesh and contaminating the product. Things like nicotine, fuel from the boats that may be utilised to harvest those animals, so on and so forth. This is all leading to how we can actually manage the processes related to how we harvest, transport, process and service the client's needs through a market, and all of these need to be managed in every stage. And it leads to a process that we call traceability standards, which enables the consumer to better understand what they're buying when they're going to the market and say, hey, I'm looking for a sustainable product that comes from a sustainable fishery, for instance, and then actually thinking, well, that's the most likely product that I want to buy. Anyway, back on track. Biologically speaking, we have obviously sources of contamination as well. We've got things like bacteria, fungus, viruses, molds, insects, other organisms like potentially butterflies, cockroaches, that sort of stuff that might end up in your burgers. Quite honestly, you hear about lots of things related to McDonald's and people finding things in their food that aren't meant to be there. So we've got physical, chemical and biological sources of damage to our food. Right, and probably the biggest one, like I said, that we most frequently think about is the contaminants related to bacteria. And if we look at the little picture over here on the right, obviously the little bug isn't a bacteria, it's just a representation of a bacteria. But over 5 hours at 37 degrees, which is roughly our internal body temperature, which is why food safety is really important, because the longer that we have these bacteria in our body, the more likely they are to cause us problems, obviously. But their most ideal growth temperatures for a lot of them is 37.5 degrees or thereabouts. So if we look at this picture, within 5 hours of this product hitting our stomach, for instance, with an initial population of 100, we've already gone to the volume or the number of bacteria that are in our gut within 5 hours from 100 to 3 million. Alright, so a lot of people say, oh, I feel sick immediately after eating my dinner, or whatever it might be. True food poisoning isn't really apparent until around about 5 to 7 hours after we ingest it. Alright, and there's a lot of different types of bacteria that may lead to food poisoning, which may come from soil, air, water, cross-contamination from poor handling practices related to people picking their nose or coughing or using cigarettes, so on and so forth. So, bacteria are really simple organisms that rapidly grow and rapidly mutate, and a lot of their characteristics are a bit of sciencey stuff here, that they're single-celled, which the term of a single-celled organism is prokaryotic, and that basically means that they lack cellular organisation. All of their DNA and all of their function is just crammed inside of a shell, essentially, and it makes them quite adaptable to changes in environment, realistically. That's probably the easiest way to put it. They're very small, they can be moving or non-moving, they reproduce rapidly, as we saw from the preceding graph on the right-hand side of the page, and many of them can withstand heat and chemical challenges, I guess you might say, so things like chlorine peroxide, detergents, other sanitizers, by creating resistant spores. So a spore might lay dormant in a system, and then when the primary, what do we call it, the primary or the most, what's the easiest way to put it, the most functional conditions for them to grow appear again, those spores will hatch, and then boom, voila, we end up back in a situation where we have bacteria all over the place. Alright, so some examples of bacteria that may enter into our food processing system, or it might even necessarily be our food processing system, it may just be at home, is botulinum, same stuff that they inject into people's lips and eyebrows, or Botox surgery. We look at that there, 1 gram of pure Clostridium botulinum and toxin is capable of killing 14 million people. That's pretty outstanding numbers. Legionella, Legionnaire's disease, alright, is related to water treatment plants associated with air conditioning systems and the like, water cooling towers. Incredibly hard to knock on the head. Alright, and in this situation, this was a long time ago, about 20 years ago, killed 35 people who attended a week-long conference in Philadelphia. And then they tracked it back to, hey, say, oh God, it was our air conditioning system that was the problem. Streptococcus, also known as scarlet fever or rheumatic fever, is quite prevalent in the seafood industry. Tuberculosis is probably less so, still a leading cause of death in humans, particularly in third world countries. Staphylococcus, very well known, common in hospitals, things like that. Golden staph is resistant to last resort antibiotics such as vancomycin, a really toxic form of antibiotic. And there is a couple of other forms of staphylococcus as well. And they are easy to cross-contaminate from things like inadequate sanitation of skin and hands, so on and so forth. Typhoid, generally related to poor water quality, is easily dispersed in water. Typhoid disease. And then plaque. Obviously we've got plaque, which causes cavities in teeth. So that's just a bit of an example of the types of bacteria that may span across our general knowledge of bacteria. We've got other things in there such as E. coli, which is generally related to poor water, things like not wiping your hands after, or washing your hands adequately after going to the toilet, things like that as well. Alright, so we've got a couple that you might not have heard of. We've got Vibrio, and it's a major cause of environmental death within many fisheries and aquaculture situations. And it's something that we do monitor in the pearl farming game and the pearl fishing game when we're transferring shell from different zones. So it's something that can be used in fisheries management processes to make sure that we don't transfer disease from point A to point B, ending in a quarantine problem. So we've got Eromonas, which basically eats into the fish and causes flesh degradation. Nocardia basically causes a breakdown in the flesh and ends up in the fish being really skinny. Alright, so how do we test for bacteria? There's many different ways that we can do it, but sometimes the simplest way to do it is to grab a sample of our fish, put it out onto a known nutrient media source, which is probably what we've got down here. It looks like blood agar or something down the bottom here on the page. We streak out the sample onto the plate, and these little individual colonies here are colonies of bacteria that would then go on to hopefully identify as something that's not problematic, more than likely, but if we do pop it up as something that is problematic, we would then go through the process of a quarantine or a recall on products, so on and so forth. Most of these plates contain a specific nutrients and additives, I guess. So sometimes it's a pigment that enables the bacteria to show up that is strictly related to that type of bacteria that we want to identify, and they are then grown in the most likely or the most ideal conditions for those bacteria to grow. So we might do environmental testing around our food processing facilities, on our boats, in our hatcheries, whatever it might be, or it might be directly associated with the product itself. That's what that goes on to ascertain there. So how do we prevent contamination? I don't really think hard hats or goggles or steel cap boots, harnesses, pads, so on and so forth are going to really do the job. Right, even though that we might be doing or adapting our process within food handling to incorporate those for PPE purposes to prevent ourselves from being damaged. But what are some likely ways that we can prevent contamination? Number one is personal hygiene. So we may change our clothes before entering a food processing facility. We may clean our boots, we might clean our hands, we might wear hair nets, beard nets, who knows. list goes on. But personal hygiene is one of the most critical things that we can think about to prevent contamination. Alright, obviously we go on there, we limit the chance of exposure with certain types of gear. As I said, beard nets, hair nets, long sleeves, long pants, and we may look at correct cleaning procedures, and I think we identify that in one of our presentations at an earlier stage. So it might be a dry sweep, detergent clean down with a scrubber, a rinse, another dry sweep, apply a sanitizer, rinse the sanitizer, allow it to dry, then process it, whatever we need to process, and then repeat the process again. Sometimes steam may even be used to clean down some surfaces just to make sure that we sanitize the area correctly. Alright, so that's the end of the slideshow for now. But what I want you to do is to just go away and think about some of the things that you may be able to do in your home, maybe even in the process of catching your own fish, for instance. So you might go out, what am I going to do to minimise the chance of contamination when I am out catching fish for my family? Last thing you want to do is go out and do something nice like catch a bunch of salmon or a bunch of prawns or a bunch of squid and then have it contaminated by bacteria or some physical contamination like shell grit or cigarette butts, and then feed it to your family. So just consider that, and hopefully this will help you to build on your knowledge so that when you come to your practical for me later on, that you've got a bit of an idea about what we need to think about. Right, ciao for now.